Welcome back to this latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, the president of Dale Carnegie Tokyo Training. And my special guest today is an old friend of mine, Mark Militello, who is the country representative of Bank of New York Mellon. Great to see you, Mark. And we were colleagues back in the day in Shinsei. I was in the simple part of the bank. You're in the complex part of the bank, as I recall. So great to be with you. Now, how is it you got to Japan and you're working in Japan, and how is it that you're now running Bank of New York Mellon?
Sure. No, I'll try to make it quick. Backstories, people don't like too much detail here, but nonetheless, Greg, let me just tease out a little bit more detail of your intro, because we did work together, but I would say that the retail section that you were in was the innovative portion, right? I mean, one of the first ones, as simple as having its own Starbucks in the lobby, dedicated to the company, was groundbreaking, as opposed to one in a big building, right? So that was one. I was on the institutional side, and you had fee transfers, and you had a whole bunch of other stuff that led to attractions that led to a couple million as a percentage of retail customers for Shinsei Bank. You and your team, Sajeev Thomas and others, were highly innovative. So I give you credit for that.
Very kind.
I'm on my third tour in Japan. I started out, everyone's got their story to come over. It was actually in the bubble years, right? We're aging ourselves. I'm aging myself, at least. And late in the bubble years here. And John Mack, the legendary John Mack of Morgan Stanley, who retired a few years ago, but he had a few iterations of his career, but really sort of known as the leader of Morgan Stanley. A little bit of Credit Suisse in there as well. I happened to bump into him in the fixed income division at Morgan Stanley, where I was working as a lowly analyst.
Stanley,
New York.
As
a lowly analyst, going for a third-year analyst versus business school. That's how it was back then, right? And he said, "What do you want to do next year?"
So what does that mean, a third-year analyst versus business school?
So a lot of people were hired back in that day, investment banking, a little bit in fixed income and equities here, sales and trading, as they call it, into a two-year program. And then a two-year program after that, you're on your own. But a lot of people went to business school and then came back into investment banking or went to consulting at the time, whatever was hot at the time. And so that was typical. And so these days, it's like you want to retain talent. You don't want to throw them back into business school and train them for 2 years. So complete shift. We might get into that a little bit later in terms of talent retention and attraction, especially as it relates to bilingual Japanese. But anyway, I said, "Hey, I'd love to go to London." At the time, and he came back 2 days later and said, "What about Tokyo?" I said, okay, that'd work. I'd actually played, and I had played in college football, Duke University for what it's worth, and there was an all-star game back then called the Japan Bowl, the Ricoh Japan Bowl, right? And I was selected to play in that game somehow through my quarterback teammate. Actually, he sort of like gave me a bone as someone got injured or something like that. That's how I made it. And so that was my memory of Japan. Akihabara and dollar yen at 250, 275. It's like, oh, the Sony Walkman was brand new, not quite that new, but nonetheless, it was great. I remember leaving to go from Yokohama Stadium, where we played, to Narita Airport. It's like, whoa, that was going to take an hour. It took 3 hours. But anyway, on the way, the bus ride there, I'm never coming back to Tokyo. 3 years later, I was sent by John Mack in my Morgan Stanley days, thinking for a year or two. It turned out to be 5 years, bypassed business school, and then that was the start of it. Fast forward, I ended up being at Lehman Brothers, fixed income background for about 8 years, and then Shinsei Bank. As we came together, a lot of the Lehman people were on. Brian Prince, as you recall, was on the institutional side. Sajeev Thomas, Jay DeVetti, others, brought in others from Citi.
Citibank.
You were part of that retail side as well. And then a little time back in the U.S. as my kids went through high school. In the U.S. to finish up, and then was able to get into the Bank of New York Mellon through some Lehman connections in Hong Kong. And so I just finished 10 years in Hong Kong, and then moved to Tokyo in this role as the country head.
So you've been in a number of roles in Japan, different institutions. So let's think about some of your first leadership roles when you actually had responsibility for people here. What did you find challenging about leading in Japan?
Well, first of all, it's just being a leader to begin with, right? Much less Japan or not. So how do you become a leader? So everyone's got their timeline, but you learn the school of hard knocks, at least. I remember when I was in Lehman Brothers fixed income, I took on some managerial responsibilities and took on this new desk within fixed income. And everyone said, what's your plan? What's your plan? I felt like, I had an obligation to have a plan from day one, instead of saying, hey, let's work on that plan together. I have no idea what that plan was, right? But I felt like, I had to answer them, right? So I'm already digging a hole from day one, right? Instead of like, hey, let's work on it together, as I mentioned, right? What are your, tell me about your background, get to know the people, get to know the clients, get to know the opportunity. So you have to develop your own leadership first, and that is developed, right? You can learn from a different, from observing, you can learn, from books, whatever it is, but so then you layer on top of that as a gaijin in Japan, as a manager, there's a whole another story, right? I think there it's really more, and this might lead to some other questions down the road, Greg, but it's really more of showing respect for the country, showing respect for the people, showing that you have their back, right? Collectively, our back, and I'm talking about from a perspective of a foreign manager with a US-based institution, financial institution, maybe European as well, right? Slightly different management style there, but from a US-based one. And typically, there are not a lot of Americans that have a lot of experience in Japan especially. If you look to Hong Kong and Singapore, a little bit different story, especially from the European side of things, but from Japan, there's not a lot of institutional knowledge typically built in to many Japanese financial institutions. And so, back in the early day, I won't name people, won't name companies, won't name divisions, but I mean, really back in the early day, I remember someone was hired, he speaks Japanese, and you think I'm making this up, it's not true, but he spent a couple years in Taiwan, as an exchange student, a year and a half, and learned the language. Wave him in. He was hired. He did a great job, but he was hired because he thought he spoke Japanese.
He actually spoke Chinese.
There you go.
Don't worry about the small details.
Yeah, exactly. Wave him in.
Come to Tokyo, you're a fluent Chinese speaker, you'll be perfect.
There you go. Now, I mentioned John Mack early on from Morgan Stanley. To his credit, he would always be on planes, on airplanes. He did the CICC venture in China way back when, and they monetized that at the financial crisis in a big way because he planted the seeds early, right? He knew the international expansion was important, and he was on a plane often. But you can't say that for too many people, right? And things have changed cross-border, the diversification of the employee base as well. We've come, I think U.S. firms overall toward Japan have come a long way. There's still a bit of a gap. There's that comfort gap. I've got a colleague in Hong Kong that it took about, almost 10 trips to come to Tokyo, to visit Tokyo, to get a level of comfort where they can navigate the city and they feel comfortable. It wasn't a foreign visit, at which point then his view turned dramatically. Once he had that comfort level, then it's like, there's business opportunity here, as opposed to, I don't want to go to Tokyo. I don't want to go to Tokyo. Of course, people want to go for tourist purposes, the food is great, et cetera, but when it comes to the business integration, a little bit different. So things have changed dramatically that way. I would say, slightly different from your question, what also has changed, smoking. On the trading floor that I was on, you could smoke openly back when I first came, believe it or not. It was like, oh my goodness, this is terrible. Somehow that changed, right? It followed more slowly than the US, the rest of the world. But now it's pretty good, right? Shotoku, I think, was the first coup that said you can't walk and smoke, right, as you know. So we've come a long way from a culture, and that's not a leadership answer, but just in terms of anecdotally what my experience has been.
Just on that thing about the leadership, you talk about appreciating the culture and understanding where you are, but in a lot of cases, particularly in finance, a lot of the leadership in constructs in finance are not originating in Japan, they're originating in the States. So when people are coming in from, let's, in inverted commas, say, a more progressive or advanced atmosphere or environment to Japan, there is that danger, I guess, of hubris and thinking, we know it all, Japanese are behind, we need to show them. So that concept of actually trying to understand the local environment may not be as strong as it needs to be. And so there's a little bit of danger of saying, well, these people have to snap into line here to sort of catch up with where we are, and I'm the one in the responsibility position here to force them to do that and start, driving things. So just get your thoughts on that, because that can often be the case, that particularly they're sent from headquarters. What's your plan?
Sure.
How are you going to make this happen in Japan? How are you going to get the numbers in Japan? We expect numbers from you. You're being paid the big bucks. We're expecting results. Like, you're all that sort of pressure before you even get on the plane. So you turn up here, and that respect for the culture, respect for the way things are done here can be out the window.
It's a fine line, exactly. It's a difficult line. And, I think the best leaders here, walk that line nicely here. It can go either way over time, but you really need to balance that. And, if you're seen as like an order taker from headquarters in New York, you're not going to get the respect. You're not going to get the buy-in. Whereas if you were seen as a defensive, defending the culture, et cetera, and this is why we're not doing business. There's 3 or 4 different reasons. They're going to be seen as excuses from headquarters, right? So you really got to walk that line.
It's a tricky line, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. And so it's so, talk to your point about sort of knowing everything or the perception of everything. Again, I gave you the language example of Mandarin versus Japanese, which was true. That was a few decades ago.
Hilarious. That's a hilarious story, by the way.
But even to this day, I've got to think too. It's easy to fall in when you're hiring somebody at whatever level, junior, mid-level, senior. You don't want to have an all-English interview panel. You've got to have some of the local Japanese interviews. So how are they going to integrate culturally? How is their Japanese, right?
Well, that's right. You've got to check their Japanese levels, right?
Without a doubt. Yeah. But so many times it's like, okay, well, maybe at the end after the decision's made, we'll have one person interview. That's Japanese. And so, but it's a bit too late. You have to integrate early, because the big, whether it's hiring people or whether it's going to a meeting, you're flying in from New York for 3 days, you go to the meeting and the big banks throw out their good English speakers and, oh, that was a great meeting. Was it? Why was it, right? So because they said yes, 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 yes. Their English was good, but...
We could communicate.
That was it. We thought what was really said underneath that is like, the gaijin will go home and we'll get on with our business, right? So that's something to watch out for too. Those are basics, but you got to be careful. You got to be careful. So walking that fine line, that balancing that line is very important. Those are 2 examples.
And apart from being the fact of a leader, which is challenging in itself, and some things you talked about, having walk that fine line, what were some other things you found challenging about leading in Japan?
Yeah, I think good question. So let's get to the crux of it now. It's like so every company has its silos. Every culture has its silos. And how do you create a team, right? And it goes to the culture, I think, question that we're going to sort of get into here throughout the course of the podcast here, is that you really have to create a vision and a team approach so people see that common vision, so they can maybe see why they should coordinate across business lines, and or, hey, my boss is in New York or London or something like that. I don't have to talk to that person or to me, right? So we have to really... That's a challenge. That's on the one hand. On the other hand...
So what you're talking about there is the matrix structural organization of big companies today where, for example, you might be the country representative for Bank of New York Mellon, but a lot of your direct reports have got direct lines to people outside of the country and dotted lines to you. Yeah. And you've got to lead these people, sure, even though their assessments are being done by someone else in the main. In the old days, you were here, you were the boss, it was very clear. That's a much more complicated structure, isn't it?
It is complicated, and that goes back to that fine line, because you can put on paper whatever you want. Hey, I've got a double matrix or double hard line or hard line matrix, whatever you call it, or I have a dotted line matrix. It almost doesn't matter. It's how effective you are with the individuals on site in Japan, and as well as their reporting lines there. It can be clean on paper and you can be ineffective, or it could be nothing on paper and you can be very effective, or somewhere in between. So that's a challenge as a leader to get to the right spot. And a lot of times in some areas you're effective and other times you're less effective. So part of it's personality-based as well. One leadership beyond that challenge is, again, we talk about sort of English as a native language, English coming in, speaking to the Japanese clients, but from a Japanese, if your headquarters in Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and many banks are, your global headquarters are London or New York, Paris, wherever, The challenge is how to make sure that the Japanese team understands the issue, communicates, and can be effective. It's really hard for very few Japanese can navigate a global firm effectively.
So what you're talking about there is, in a matrix organization, they're going to be dealing directly much more with colleagues in APAC,
Sure,
because of time zone, some degree in Europe and America. So whereas before maybe there was more of a structural hierarchy in the country, that matrix has blown that up. So people now, they might be leading people in those countries depending on the role, or maybe reporting to people in those countries depending on the role. So their ability to communicate with their colleagues in APAC and extended is probably at a much higher level of requirement than maybe in the past.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Part of that's the digital world here that we're in. And let me just restate what I said for clarity here. Very few Japanese can navigate global U.S.-based firms, right? Mm-hmm. It could be global Japanese firms, Japanese firms that are global, Tokyo-based or Asia-based, but U.S.-based firms, it's much more of a challenge, I think, given the culture and structure.
Is that language? Is that having presence in the meetings? What is that?
I think it's. I think part of it's cultural here. Part of it's like it gets to an innovation discussion here, maybe a little bit later. It's like, how do we get the best ideas out of the team? And if you're third in the pecking order here in age or rank or both, right? Typically both. How can I say something by email, by conference call, by whatever, any form of communication to somebody overseas, wherever that might be, because it should come from my boss or it should come from my boss's boss. That's a big challenge, right? So we can get into that a little bit more. So
this is this coming back to different thinking about accountability? Because in a Western environment, you're expected to take accountability. You're expected to even exceed your accountability in terms of innovation or stepping up to the plate or trying to become more accountable so you can move up the ladder, right? Yeah. So people appreciate that. They expect that. But in a Japanese context, it's all about, well, my level, my rank, or actually if I say this, maybe I'm overstepping the mark, my boss is going to be unhappy, maybe I don't have the authority to have that discussion. They're restraining themselves in that Japanese cultural context. Is this the issue?
No, absolutely, absolutely. And those few that might go beyond, they're viewed as a little bit more aggressive. It's like, like, what are you trying to do? You're trying to break us apart here, right? So it's a double-edged sword. So it's a very tough challenge. I will say, and let's go through this a little bit more here in a minute here, but I will say also a challenge is when a mandate, a suggestion, a order, whatever is received from someone in New York, someone in Hong Kong, London, Singapore, wherever, it's typically perceived as sort of a yes or no, right? This is your orders, this is your mandate, not orders, those too strong a word, so let's go, let's do it. When it's really an iterative process, right? That is very gray, as they say, right? Ambiguous here. It's like, we don't know what the end game is going to be. We think we're trending in this direction. Help us out. But it's always like, oh, this is what I heard. This is what so I'm not going to go that direction because I didn't hear that. Or I've got other ideas, but I'm not going to bring them up because that's not the mandate. So it's whereas the people outside of Tokyo are just looking for the local expertise and help. And so a lot of times they're just crossing this way. And I think the Gaijin leader here can see that, can help see that, and can help demystify the process, but really get the ideas out there, bring both sides together. And here's what really we're looking for here. So, otherwise, also, it's more like, hey, let's get an interim update every week, every day, whatever it is. If the deadline's in a month, don't wait a month with wrong expectations. You may think you're completely right. I didn't hear that, but the person from overseas is going to say, "What? We didn't do anything a month. What happened? What happened?" That's not uncommon, And that's one of the biggest challenges, right? On a daily basis, right? Be able to sort of, let's ferret out the issues here and make sure we're together on what you're looking for, right? It goes both ways. It's not just sort of, always the Japanese being looked at there, but it's the other way too. It's like, okay, the American side or the Western side is like, okay, there's challenges there too, right? So it goes both ways, but that goes back to sort of the cross-border ability or challenge that a lot of the Japanese have in navigating the American-based firm. Those few that can do it will probably excel, are excelling, and will further excel.
And in terms of thinking about engagement, there's a debate about engagement scores as a statistical entity in its own right. And I no doubt you've sat through these meetings where a global organisation looks at their engagement levels around the world. Usually everywhere else is very high and APAC is lower, and bottom of APAC is Japan, and then you have this pressure on, well, hey, listen, the Japanese team's obviously not engaged. And you're running the operation, you better fix it type of thing, And again, it's this point you made before about you can't say, oh, no, it's just Japan, because headquarters doesn't want to hear that.
Precisely.
They're not going to wear that excuse, though, so you've got to do something. And so whether we accept the statistics are correct or the structure of the questions is correct or the translation of the questions is correct, let's just put that to one side. And we can debate whether they actually are loyal, more than engaged, and what's the difference. There's no Japanese word for engagement. It's engagemental, which is katakana English, which doesn't help you at all. But in just generally your feeling about what have you seen works well in terms of getting people engaged in the company and in the job?
Good question, Greg. I think just being transparent. Where's headquarters trying to lead? The CEO, executive committee on down. Where are they trying to lead? What am I trying to do as a country head to get the engagement going? And it's also it's important to give a voice to as many people as possible. It's not just the key. This ties into one of your earlier questions about leadership challenge. You've got to go beyond your leadership team. Right, your leadership team is typically of a certain dynamic or demographic, I should say, maybe dynamic as well, that have been X number of years in the industry, mostly men, not more and more women, of course, but mostly men here, and they have been brought up, Japanese company, they moved to the gaishike, and they've got their certain style, and so. And maybe because of the gaishike, maybe people they manage are a little bit more comfortable, and that's why they're working for a foreign company instead of a Japanese company. Nonetheless, that background, that culture is still there, and so it's important to go beyond the old skip level, right? Plus everybody, right? So, but show transparency. And what I did, I'll give you one anecdote here, is we had recently, which was surprising, shockingly, really, I wouldn't say shocking, but we'll call it shocking, in terms of the level of engagement that this elicited. We are renovating our office right now, right? And to sort of, after many of our other branches have done so, right? So we're renovating our office, sort of exciting time. What's a new place going to look like? Post-COVID, slimming down a little bit as well. And we said, okay, well, we got these conference rooms. Our conference rooms right now are imaginatively named A, B, C, D, E, and F. Okay, well, maybe we should put a contest together, right? Just started out, 2, 3 people talking, put a contest together. Let's have naming contests, and we'll give a grand prize out of a Starbucks gift certificate, right? But it didn't matter what it was, exactly. So we ended up saying, okay, let's name. So bear with me on this because it's worthwhile, I think. Let's figure out what the themes are to name, because how are we going to have a contest if everyone just throws in their own name, right? So we give us the themes, and whoever had there's not one winner, there's a number of winners here. So themes were like, okay, the gates of Edo, gates around the Imperial Palace, right?
Okay.
Otemon, et cetera, Hanzomon, right? Et cetera, was one. Another one was the World Heritage Site. Another one, since we overlooked Tokyo Station, was the Shinkansen, names of the Shinkansen, whole bunch of different names. Another one was the rivers of Japan, the mountains of Japan, et cetera, right? The islands of Japan. We probably had 20 different things. So the winner, the top two were the gates of Eidojo and as well as the World Heritage Site. So whoever voted for those two out of whatever, I think we 11 we ended up with, got a gift certificate. And so we intentionally gave out a lot, right? We had the top two as opposed to the top one.
More winners is better than fewer winners, right?
But people are following them. This all took place within a week. And then we said, okay, fine. Now it's the World Heritage Sites. There's 25 of them or whatever the number is, something like that. And so here we are. Let's list, you rank the top 5, top 6. And so whoever gets the top, based on, we didn't know how many we're going to get right. So we ended up giving whoever had the top 3 of the 5 would get a prize. And it turned out to be, you could guess Fujisan and Nikko and Kyoto and and a few others, right? The national park in Hokkaido, but everyone's got their home prefecture. I'm voting for this. I'm voting for that, right? And so it really got things going. And then when the winners were announced, there was a grand prize for whoever got both categories right. Anyway, long story short here is that it was a great, well-received. Who would have thought that, right? Within a week of actually coming up with the idea and then executing, it's like, oh, this is great. And then we made it honor. We showed our pictures there when we had a town hall. We gave them their gift certificates. It was great, So anyway, that was maybe a serendipitous way of getting engagement. I guess the broader theme is really finding a way to listen to all employees, and not just sort of the top management there, but all employees, and getting to know them a little bit. This weaves into your earlier question. Too, it's like, it's good to, I'm the worst Japanese speaker in my family here, but having been here so long, it should be much better. But, you just knowing ahead when I first came here, because I've been here a long time, right? You have all the bank history, right? Mizuho is an amalgamation of 3 different banks, which banks, et cetera, et cetera. MUFG, we're having the Bank of Tokyo, so I always joke around with our Bank of Tokyo alums, like, what happened to your Tokyo name? But just knowing that, one of the persons said, oh gosh, you know all the bank history, that's highly appreciated. I said, not really, but just shows that I'm old. But nonetheless, just elicited that comment, right? So a little bit of cultural awareness, I think, goes a long way. Also, again, it's maybe style to probably, but it's like knowing where people have prefectures, right? If people are from Kansai, I'll throw a little Hanshin Tigers trivia at them, or throw a little Kansai Ben at them, or something like that. So, maybe it gets old, but I think it's appreciated.
So what you're talking about there, I guess, is trying to bring the understanding down to the individual level, find something of commonality and let them lead it. Because what happened there was you were actually getting them to decide the names as opposed to I've decided the names, and getting that welling up of interest, right? So that's always well appreciated, as you say, on the receiving end.
And that goes to sort of your leadership point earlier that we're going to get to, which is, okay, what defines a leader? In my mind, it's almost like it's that style, right? It's like you don't want to be the gaijin from New York or Hong Kong or wherever saying this is what you're going to do. You can lead them in the right direction. We don't know what the end game is or the right answer is anyway as a foreigner here or as a local, right? But let's have that discussion. Here's the direction we're going in. Let them, there might be silence initially. So I'll call on people. They sort of know that, very on Japanese style. I'll call on people, but people that are comfortable, that I know are comfortable, are used to my style here. But once people start talking, then others will talk, or I'll have a conversation with somebody that's a mid-level person that I know won't surprise him or her because we talked about that yesterday, and say, hey, tell us more about what we talked about, right, in a bigger group. And
so you're not calling them out on the spot.
Correct.
Which most Japanese don't appreciate very much, do they?
Correct, right.
They like some warning, they can think about it.
It's a little bit of both, but, got to keep them on their toes, right, a little bit. But, that's it. But it's really more guiding them in the direction, because there's going to be stone silence at first. You have to show them, talking about sort of the building a team and a common vision or a mandate and how we're going to solve this problem, show them this is the direction initially, right? Whether it's my own idea or some, it doesn't matter, right? We just got to show them the way, and then let's figure out, let's have iterative processes locally, regionally, globally, whatever it takes to get to the right answer, as opposed to, the country head saying this is the answer, right? We have no idea.
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English.
We have no idea.
It's a tricky one, isn't it, though? Because sometimes I find that because they're all educated in the same system, it's a very rote learning-based system. It's very regimented. That, at 11 o'clock every Japanese kid's doing mathematics, type of thing. It is a system like that. That often, not coming from within the system, you're not bound by the containment of that system. And so you're able to think beyond that. And sometimes one of the things that we bring to the party is just being able to see things from a different viewpoint, or questioning why we do it that way and challenging why we do it that way. So that very tricky balance of not being totally directive, but at the same time also being a bit of a challenger and maybe, calling out some sacred cows here and asking, well, why is that cow sacred after all? Could we do it a different way? Because I find myself in the creative side, trying to get creativity, sometimes stepping out of the mainstream gets you where you want to go. So let's talk a little bit about creativity. What have you found works well with getting the teams to be creative?
So I think, and let me just make a point on your last comment, which leads into this creativity. It's it's our responsibility as the gaikokujin or gaijin leader here to play the role so that, be it internal or be it with clients. With clients, if you have a senior meeting, ask the question that your colleagues can ask. They won't ask culturally. Yeah. This is your opportunity. And 90% of the time, it will be answered, probably truthfully, right? And so you have to play that card, which is just, it's a given. Anyway,
what do we say, ask for forgiveness, not for permission, right?
Yes, there you
ask
go.
A tough question and then be prepared for the result.
But if a colleagues asked it in Japanese, I think they would be horrified, and the clients would be horrified as well. But it's okay if you're from overseas or the country head, you can ask those questions, right? You got to be balanced, but ask those questions. Innovation. Banks aren't known to be innovative. From a fintech perspective, from a digital perspective, Bank of New York was one of the first to get involved in digitization, a little bit of crypto announcement, but the digitalization and the fintech, the payments automation, Japan is catching up. Not that the U.S. is a leader, necessarily, but there's a lot of upside here. Just during COVID, just being able to not have the seal, the hunko, right, was a big in the e-signatures was a big thing, and having Japanese firms. Work.
That hunko is the seal, the personal seal. Yeah. Now the crazy thing is, when we put out our invoices, it's all electronic, and the seal is imprinted in the electronic document. But some companies say, no, you have to print it out and send it to us.
Correct. Yeah.
But if they printed it out, it'd be there as well. It's like, well, why? Yeah. But no, that's what we expect. So this sort of thing is hard to understand sometimes.
We expect a little bit more innovation as well. I know in the Kishida-san government, digitization is a big push, right? One of the 5 pillars. And but in terms of innovation overall, I guess it goes with the theme. Not necessarily. So why are people working at a foreign company as opposed to a Japanese company? That's a first step. That's not. So they're a little bit not. They're looking for a little bit of independence, right? Implicitly or explicitly, they're looking for a little bit of independence as opposed to working through the Japanese companies. And maybe they've worked for a Japanese company before, but making the split. Some of that could be a financial opportunity. But generally speaking, there's a reason there, implicitly or explicitly. And so they're already on the path or off the path, however you want to look at it. Then it comes down to too, it's age. I mean, look at ourselves. Look at people in their 20s or 30s, right? The ability to to navigate through social media, to just be up on what's happening, right, in the innovation world, which cuts across a lot of different things. And so having the new graduates still come, right, which is hard in Japan here, but we've having new graduates and input and getting their input, right? Before it's like, oh, if you're a Japanese company, this is what you do. So we have to value them. It's a global thing, though. It's not just a Japanese thing. It's a global thing, right? So especially in this great resignation that we just finished, I guess. But so to get...
Or inflation finished it.
There you go. So from the new grads to anybody who's joining a foreign firm, they're a little bit not the traditional Japanese company, sarariman or woman, right? And then there's a whole group in between that probably, if asked, they're, this person's a surfer on the weekend, right? Well, you'd never know it by looking at him, right? But, they're not, maybe that's the traditional way, but nonetheless, there's people out there that like that independence. So if you know that and can bring that out in some... It could be a whiteboard session. It could be a project. It could be whatever. And then they start to get some ideas flowing. It's got to be a safe environment, right? Because always they're thinking, to what you said before, my boss is here, my boss's boss is there. We're sort of in the same meeting.
I'm a woman.
Yeah, true.
Men,
that as well. Exactly
I'm young.
Right.
They're older.
Yeah.
So and so joined before me.
Yeah.
They've got a status position higher than mine. I should defer to all of them, which is all really, it's a big loss, because often the people who are the more junior, depending on the product, can be closer to the consumer, can be closer to the buyer.
Yeah.
And it depends on the industry, depends on the product, but often they don't even get a chance to input anything. So who's making the decisions? I often feel that myself, and I'm a lot older than most of my team, so how relevant is my view on things about what's going on at the moment? So often maybe not relevant, so you've got to really get them involved, otherwise you miss out. So that whole point about having people who are, presumably, they want to speak in English, they want to work in a national environment, they want to have that flexibility, they want to be able to express themselves, that's a really good core asset to have, isn't it? But then if you don't use that asset, and it's top-downer all the time, it's a complete waste.
No, exactly. Well stated. Well stated there. So I think in innovation, firms globally are trying to work on it. Even the return to office, right? How do we become?
Have you guys gone back to the office? You're renovating, so
we're renovating.
But
globally, we're we've got the hybrid model, so a little so less restrictive, right? Actually, a lot less restrictive than some of these. Big banks, investment banks, at 5 days in the office. So if you're client-facing, you're sales and trading, a lot of people are in 4 or 5 days. They want to be anyway. But if you're in an operations group, role, it could be 2 or 3 times a week. So it depends. We're just getting back into that, as you say, in Japan with our refit. But globally, that's what we're rolling out. So a little bit softer, however you want to put it, more humane way of looking at it's sort of what we're doing for the Bank of New York. Other firms are much more strict. And so I think that will pay off for us, right, in the future as we try to attract and retain talent. People have gotten used to it. If you're in operations and you're a working mom with 2 kids in school, you don't want to be commuting 45 minutes to an hour and 10 minutes, every day. But if it's 2 days a week, fine, you manage your schedule. 3 days a week, you manage your schedule accordingly. Now, the good thing is, this goes back to sort of the differences in managing. One of your initial questions is like the Japanese talent is so dedicated, right? And these are maybe cliches here, but they're pretty much all true. So dedicated, so thorough, thinking about the team, less so the individual. And that goes a long, long way. It makes your job to lead less challenging. There's many challenges, but it's offset by that, compared to other employee bases, certainly in the West.
And, what about building trust? Because there is an element of trust that, because of that dedication, they're not under directive vision, they're at home, but you trust that they're working, you trust that they're pulling their weight, you trust they're doing what they should be doing. as opposed to watching Netflix all day, right? So there's an element of trust both ways. What have you found has worked well in engendering trust in Japan?
I think, well, from the return to office perspective, you've got a job to do, and there's various ways to figure out what those are. But no one really likes a micromanager, whatever the level of that employee is, however inexperienced or experienced that person is. And so it's really training the managers is really important. And the more consistent the managers are, I mentioned before about, well, if they're brought up a certain way and they're of a certain age of your leadership team, you have to almost unlearn many things. Just as a country head coming over from the U.S. or from Hong Kong or from wherever, you have to unlearn many things because now you're in a new country the same way. And so building the trust, the return to office example, in addition to, is really, as a Gaijin leader here, is to really walk the walk, right? Again, another cliche here, but let them know that you have their back. Let them know. Look at the U.S. Ambassador, Rahm Emanuel, right? You see his Twitter feed, and he's out running around the Imperial Palace, or he's out taking the local subway, or he's pictures on the, and he's not in his black car, and he's not. I'm sure he's got some of that, right? But he's out, among the team, right? And going to a client meeting tomorrow, 15-minute walk away, nice fall weather here for once, and let's take a taxi. No, let's walk. We're going to walk, right? We're going to walk. We're going to talk when we walk, right? And as opposed to a taxi. So it's slightly different from your question there, but it's really just showing the team that you're invested, right? And so if you're invested and you show that you have their back as well, maybe something got mixed up here when we report it back to New York. Don't worry, we'll work on it next time, okay? No problem. Simple mistake, we're going to catch things. So you just have their back in a number of ways, like whether it's a promotion, whether it's a compensation issue. It's so easy if decisions are made out of New York, London, wherever the headquarters are, about compensation. It's so easy. I'm going to pay this person sitting next to me or over there locally a little bit more. I see him all the time, even in this environment now, right? You got to fight for your team, right? So far away from headquarters, you got to fight for your team. You got to have their back. And sometimes you're successful and sometimes you're not. But the effort is seen. The effort is genuine. And that builds some respect, right, in terms of trust.
What about culture, building a culture? Because normally in big organizations, you have an umbrella culture that's in the headquarters. And then, being global organisations, you have subcultures in country by country, office by office, division by division, section by section, I guess, as it sort of filters down. But when you get to Japan and you've got this sort of umbrella culture from headquarters, but it's got to be modified for Japan. So what have we found that works well in building a culture in Japan for the team to identify with the team, because they're not Americans. Yeah. They're in Japan, they're Japanese, they're professionals working here, but it's got to be a culture that fits. Like, for example, as a training company, we've been here since, nearly 60 years next year. All the materials we get from the States, we take that and then we change it, because often the examples won't work in the language or the context won't work, so we put it into a Japanese context to make it real. In the same way that we come up with our vision, mission, values, etc., for our team here to make it real for them. So you sort of start stepping it down to get to a local level that people can identify with. So what have you found works well in terms of building a culture?
I think that one of the best ways is to have people from overseas visit. Doesn't matter where it's coming from. But if you're in the executive committee or you're head of a business in Asia, it's to come to Tokyo, right, and see it. Now, as a starting point, however, Japan is huge. Economically, it's huge. Number 3 globally, right? And even though it's had its challenges the last few decades, right, it's still huge. It's cash rich, and it's very sophisticated when it comes to different industries, and they've got big, Toyota. Look at their global footprint, right? Look at some of the banks' global footprint. Manufacturing, all over the place globally. It's a good thing. And so that's a starting point. That's sometimes lost if you're from London or the US. It's all about China. Okay, well, let's talk about how you're going to monetize in China if you're a Western organization.
You're going to get your money out.
Yeah, no, there you go. That as well.
As well, right?
Exactly. And yet we've got these big institutions that, they're looking for partners. We're looking for ways to mutually, improve our businesses. And so let's not overlook that. But having the people from overseas come into Tokyo and see that. That's hard, especially in post-COVID. Now we're starting to get some visitors here. I think it's a surprise. It's a surprise to many, not to all, but to many. So
how does that impact the culture here? What's okay? You bring in people from outside. They begin to appreciate how big the country is as an economic giant, et cetera, how sophisticated it is, how clean it is, how safe it is. They get all that. But what does that mean for the culture of the people here?
So just from a human nature perspective, it's going to be the people that are visiting or say, okay, well, I understand what they're doing. There's good opportunity here. I got to understand them, know them, my colleagues a little bit better. So that's just, just don't take that for granted because Japan's so far away from headquarters. And right, when people come to Asia, they'll go to maybe Singapore or Hong Kong, and maybe there's a China angle there too. So who knows, right? So whereas Tokyo is a little bit shorter to fly to, so don't skip Tokyo. Yeah, in other words, and so that's part of it. Another part would be then if you're looking to build your team. Okay, well, you've got investment, sort of personal time investment from the senior people coming from New York, Hong Kong, et cetera. And I sort of need one person in a client-facing position, or I need one person in an operations perspective, or compliance, or whatever it is. Remember, we met the FSA, this is what we need. And so they have an appreciation for that as opposed to, it's always hard to get headcount anywhere, right? Globally to any firm at any time, but that just helps invest in that story, right? Mm-hmm. The growth story, if you're in a growth market, I think we're in a growth market in Japan, even with the macroeconomic situation being, pretty flat line over the last period of time.
So what about the culture of the team? Like, for example, in our case, pre-COVID, with COVID, no difference. 9 o'clock every day, we go through. Someone will take turn to lead it. We've got a spreadsheet. It's by rotation. So it says who's leading today and who's leading tomorrow, so you know what's coming up. Okay. They go through the vision, mission, values, all these mantras, all this tribal stuff we've got, what's the good news, what's the Dale Carnegie principle of the day, who are we visiting, who's visiting us, what are your top 3 priorities, motivational quote. It's a sort of standard little kit, but it builds culture. It really builds the culture, the why. It's always coming back to the why we are doing what we are doing, so it's based around that. That's what we do. I'm just wondering, what have you seen for the team itself? As a unit, what have you seen works well in building culture?
Yeah, no, good question. I think, in fact, what you mentioned, what you do here, I'm sure part of that's Dale Carnegie globally, but I think some of that you instituted at Shinsei Bank, now that you say it, right, in terms of the daily huddle, right? So that was good. So it sounds like I've got something to learn from you. It's hard to integrate all at first, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone at once, different lines, different, as we said before, different matrix lines, et cetera. So within certain teams, it can work. But to actually get all the teams to get together on a regular basis to talk about it's work in progress.
How many people in the bank?
Less than 200 in Japan.
In
right?
Japan,
so
but still 200 is a hell of a lot of people to integrate.
A lot of business lines, a lot of legal entities as well, right? So that's a challenge too. So there are different ways to do that, and that's an ongoing challenge. But within certain teams, they've had that culture already and just maybe tweak it a little bit, or others are complete rebuilds, or others are very small, and so, okay, fine, it's less challenging. So a little bit of everything, I think, as we sort of try to build it all together.
Well, what I'm talking about, I stole that from the Ritz-Carlton.
I was going to say that, but I didn't,
Well, when I was at Shinsei, he's passed away now, very young. Rico de Blanc came and gave us a talk in the retail bank about how they built their culture in the Ritz-Carlton, and I convinced Sajeev Thomas to send me to Washington, D.C. for a week to study how they did it. I brought it back and I put it into the retail bank, and we had that every shift, every group, because we had different shifts too, to try and build that culture. And then I brought that obviously into Dale Carnegie as well. It works well. In terms of, if we're giving some advice to someone who's going to be sent to Japan, they don't speak the language, they don't know the culture, what would be some advice you'd give them?
I think almost everything that you've learned, unlearn it. Come with an open mind, right? You don't know everything. You've got your basics, right? You've got your financial basics, how to navigate. You got your strengths coming from New York or wherever you're coming from, right? In terms of the network. But it's really new. I mean, every day, almost every day, there's an issue that comes up that cross-border, understands it one way, but it's not what Japanese clients think. And so we've got to really bridge that, right? How do we solve it? What's going on here? And so keep an open mind. You have to have an open mind, unlearn things, keep an open mind. I would say, some of my, so my second tour here, we had, all our kids were born here. My wife's American but speaks Japanese, and so we were able to, much better than I do. And so we were able to put our kids through the Japanese elementary school system, right? We're the only gaijin in the school. And so great for them, they speak it now. We played on the Japanese sports teams, right? And so there's baseball, a little soccer, this and that. And it was like fighting. It's like every toban or every manager, et cetera, here are the instructions. It's such detailed instructions. It's cold out tomorrow. Make sure you wear your jacket. And I was like, come on, gosh, don't tell us that. But you know it is. But it took me a while to realize that's just what the system is. Don't fight it. Don't fight it. So there's parts of that as a manager too. That's just how the system is. You're wasting your time fighting it. Now, understanding what that system is and then trying to navigate through that, weave through that to figure out what you want to mutually get to, go for it, right? But that's, it's like, gosh, so many challenges, right?
I fought the weather here for the first 2 years because coming from Brisbane, it's like paradise down there. It's like, this weather here is terrible. So I was the most stubborn guy ever in terms of inflexibility. Yeah. So I appreciate that. What are some other things they should be besides flexible?
I think they can, the leaders that come from overseas they should leverage their strengths, whether that's client-facing, whether that's trading, whether that's connection to the CEO and the executive committee. Just leverage their strengths because that's really, how are you going to stand out here, right? Yeah, we talked about that fine balance. You've got the global side, headquarters, and the Asia headquarters as well, and you've got the local side. You got to walk that fine balance. If you're too much on the Japan side, you're always the perception is, well, what are you doing, right? Yeah. And perception aside, it's more like how can you contribute? Right? How can you contribute to the bottom line to build your business, to help with clients, et cetera, to get a good engagement process in place so people like working here. It's all of the above. So you just got to leverage your strengths, whatever those might be. People are willing to help. People are willing to help globally, right? At least at our firm, Bank of New York, and certainly we hear that versus others. It's like we're a nice firm. Sometimes we're too nice. And so a lot of people have said that. And so leverage the good part of that, right? And so which means you've got people globally really want to help, those with minimal sharp elbows.
But that thing about being nice, I mean, it's probably an outdated metaphor now, but you had for example, my imagination, I've not lived or worked in England, but my imagination was a sort of patriarchal, in those days anyway, owner of the business and treated all the staff like family, And there was a certain atmosphere in that type of old-style English manufacturer or something like that, right? And to some extent, that's here too, that the sense of, well, if we get rid of a whole bunch of you, we're going to get a jump in our share price and all the investors are going to make more dough, so you're all gone, That sort of trade-off here isn't well appreciated. And so that idea that we're a family, we stick together, we look after each other through the good times and the bad times, we don't sack people. It's a sort of, I'm going to use the word paternalistic because it's mainly males running the system here. But is that sense there. And so being a nice firm, I would think, culturally would probably fit in nicely with how the Japanese think about where they're going to be taken care of by the company. Let's think about put your muffs on, jacket, there's so many centimetres between the platform and the train and, stand on the yellow line and don't forget to leave in the cab, don't leave anything in the cab, all the sort of nanny state type of stuff, which from some points of view might be too much, but it's part of a whole here, And so that thing about having people feel you're trying to help them, take care of them, I think that's a real core part of how the Japanese want to be treated. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
No, well put, Greg, well put. And I think, we're looked at from a client perspective as more trusted, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe the niceness that I mentioned, right, it comes out in terms of how we service the client, right? Mm-hmm. And how because we have to cooperate globally, we have to cooperate mm-hmm. locally here. And so maybe it manifests that way. But the trusted side is important just because we're, at heart, we're still a custody bank. Yes, we're making moves on the digitization of custody. We're big in the collateral space here in Japan, investment management space, et cetera. But at the heart of at the core of it, we're the most trusted bank on Wall Street, we like to say, right? And so I think niceness is maybe a part of it, right? That's important, but I don't want to overstate it too, because we're fighting every day. Right? Exactly, yeah. We're fighting every day in the trenches, right? So, I think the rest of the world, especially through COVID, it's and as banks fight for talent, tech is everywhere, right? It's like I think the banks have woken up a little bit, right? It can't all be about profits. That being said, it's I think attrition has been so high and this great resignation that the staff cuts haven't had to happen. But now, where is the next turn in the macroeconomic cycle? It looks a bit ominous, right? And so, are we going to start to see some, right? Some of the tech firms have stopped their hiring. That doesn't mean they're cutting, but are they hiring back through attrition? Probably not. So they're losing. So what are the Wall Street firms, the bank's going to do? We'll see.
But yet, your unemployment rate is incredibly low in the States anyway.
Yeah, no, correct.
And here too, it's incredibly low. So where do all these people go who resign? What are they doing? Should leaders learn Japanese? You mentioned your family.
No, exactly. If I had to do it initially,
fluent speakers.
Yeah, no, initially. Again, it goes back to my Japan Bowl football game. It's like, I'll never come back to Japan. And then with tour one, I'm here for 1 year. It turns out to be 5 years. So why didn't I invest? So no, actually, if you had to do it again, I would definitely throw myself into it. You have your own story of learning Japanese.
Well, can you get anywhere though? I mean, if you're here for 3 years, that's pretty giddy.
It's always the excuse, though, right? I guess you can look at it as an excuse.
5 years would be better.
Who knows what could happen? Who knows what could happen? I know, just looking at, so if you look at the hiring in Hong Kong from Hong Kong unis or Hong Kong, people that were educated overseas, or Koreans that there's a good number of good English-speaking Koreans. There's a good number of Cantonese, Mando speaking that speak English as well. Fewer Japanese for many reasons, right? School year, et cetera. Even sending people to business schools less and less now. There's fewer. So if you're a gaijin and can pick up Japanese, there's a niche there. There's more than a niche. There's a great opportunity if you take the longer view. It's just people don't take that longer view typically. A lot of people that others have hired over time are from the JET program, right? They're in the Naka, for a year or 2 or 3.
They're nowhere.
Yeah, they're nowhere. They're forced to learn Japanese. They don't have any financial experience. Doesn't matter, right? And so they've done great.
That's okay. Speaking. That's okay, Dan. I'm talking about we're sending.
So it's hard, yeah. So if you're 3 years and we're
sending Mary to Japan to run the operation, should Mary learn Japanese? That's my question, I guess.
I see. Hard to do so. And so, probably, I'm sure there's some studies out there. It might be a struggle once your neurons after you're a certain age stop growing for the languages, below the age of 4 or something like that, right? But, if you're in your 20s, 30s versus, at some point it all crystallizes. It might become easier, but you have to spend a lot of time. And very few people have the time and the commitment to want to do that. And so at a certain level, you're probably going to max out. The risk reward isn't going to be there, if that's the right term. And but it goes back to finding that balance, because throwing some words around, right, in it could be a little bit of humorous way, casual way, serious way, doesn't matter. you get the respect of the team. I'm trying, right? I'm trying. It's not just, hey, I'm taking Japanese 2-3 times a week, but you actually show it. So
Yeah, Dave Bennett, who used to run Lenovo here, his predecessor was an Aussie called Rod Lappin, David was reminding me that Rod went to some industry association as a speaker, and he gave it his first year. He gave the speech in English. And he said, next year I'm coming back, I'll do this in Japanese. And he did, which is just phenomenal. And you can imagine, I was thinking when he told me that story, unfortunately Rod passed away quite young, way too young. But I'm just thinking, if you're working for Lenovo and your boss turns up from overseas and says, next year I'm coming back, going to do this in Japanese, and they do it, wow, I can imagine the impact on the team would have been tremendous. Like, wow, our boss, and his commitment, and so it is a struggle, isn't it? I mean, I'm still trying to learn the language, and I've been here for 37 years, still struggling with it. And still there are things that, I know I'll probably never get. So it's a time trade-off, isn't it? It's a difficult question.
Yeah, it's hard. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, what would be some other advice you give someone who's brand new to Japan, some final advice for them? What would be another thing they should think about?
Well, enjoy the country. It's beautiful, right? So,
it is a great place,
head on the Shinkansen.
Don't spend all the time in the office.
No,
right?
exactly, right? Even Tokyo, right? Tokyo is a much greener city from the concrete jungle that we first came to know, right? So, the build up to the '98 Winter Olympics in Japan in Nagano helped, hasten the Shinkansen lines, right? Because there's very basic ones before, but now you can get all this in the Nagano in 90 minutes. And similarly, the Summer Olympics here, right? Just a couple of years ago, right? It's like great infrastructure, and that was planned 10, 15 years prior, right? All these tunnels now, and
it's amazing.
Remember the days when we took the limousine bus from Narita Airport, right? And Narita, and you could sort of on the runway, maybe still be there. I haven't gone there in a while because it's all Haneda these days. Is that the protesters, the couple houses that were delaying that. The extra runway. Yeah. But, it's like such a madhouse getting back to, and then you getting back to Tokyo. Narita, you get the limousine bus, you think you're going well, and then you're stuck for 45 minutes at Urayasu, right outside Disneyland right there, right? So, because there's only one way through Hakazaki to get back into town, right? So, huge infrastructure improvement. So enjoy the city, and enjoy the country as well. And of course, everyone talks about the food is so great, et cetera. That's fine if you like it, Michelin stars restaurants, but you don't have to, right? So
I don't know. I think Tokyo is the greatest city in the world because, no guns, no drugs,
absolutely,
no crime, no graffiti, no litter. Everyone's polite.
50 million
Everything
people.
works. It's the highest quality of everything, as long as you've got the money. I mean, it's pretty hard to beat.
Absolutely.
I do like going to other major cities too, but living here is terrific.
Absolutely,
yeah.
right? You got the 4 seasons. You maybe come across, maybe you've gotten used to the weather a little bit more. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Mark, it's been great to catch up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Greg. My pleasure.
So join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.